Well, good afternoon, everybody.
I want to be in the camera.
Yeah. All right. I think that's okay. I just need to talk louder. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our December 14th Redevelopment Agency Board of Directors meeting. I'm chairing this meeting today while Anna is out of town. We welcome the members of the public who are in person and who may be watching our usual video feeds online. I'm happy to share that we have returned to this hybrid meeting approach. It's nice to see faces in the crowd instead of faces on a screen, but it is kind of interesting because I'm not sure where I should be looking because it's normally just right in front of you. Hybrid board meetings allow people to join online through the Webex and in person at the City and County building. It's nice to be meeting again in person and to be here with our members of the public, fellow board members, and the city staff. We are continuing to watch COVID rates to make this the safest choice for all of us. If you are here, join us on site. The council is following the CDC guidelines to prevent and reduce transmission of COVID-19 and maintain healthy business operations and work environments. Per an executive order signed by Mayor Mendenhall, face coverings are required for vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals inside Salt Lake City facilities. Therefore, we are asking everyone to keep your face coverings on at all times. For city staff and people here briefing items, when you're addressing the board, you can remove it to ensure that we can hear your comments. Our staff is also here to help with seating in the audience so that social distancing can also be maintained. And so we begin and we start our RDA meeting with comments to the board. If you've been here a number of times, you've probably heard this once or twice. Your feedback is always welcome, and you can just share that with your board anytime by mailing the council office at P.O. Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114, or emailing us at council.comments@slcgov.com, or by calling our 24-hour phone comment line at 801-535-7654. We're accepting your comments in person and throughout Webex, and for those whose only option is to call in, staff will be monitoring a separate telephone line. I want to mention our rules of decorum. These are guidelines to help our meetings progress in an orderly, civil, efficient manner. We will move through the agenda and want to give everyone the opportunity to voice their opinions without feeling intimidated. In order to achieve this, our rules of decorum begin from the moment you arrive into our meeting. The RDA Board respects all points of views, and we welcome new insights. Please be respectful, avoid yelling, profanity, or making racial slurs, obscene, or defamatory remarks. If you use profanity during your comments, your line will be muted. And any comments that reach a level of disrespect, I will ask that you be muted, and you will forfeit your opportunity to address the board today. If you're not able to complete your comments this afternoon, you're welcome to email the board or call our comment line. In addition, our staff will request your name during your registration process. To limit disruption, your name cannot include a message or violate our rules of decorum. If your registered name doesn't meet this requirement, then our staff will use a chat feature to gather that information from you. Delaney Silman from our staff is helping to moderate the meeting, and we'll be messaging with the attendees to coordinate any questions with your commenting registration. Staff is handling a number of tasks. Please limit messages to technical issues and minimal changes to your registration. Isaac Canedo will be calling the names of those who wish to comment and unmuting the lines. When Isaac unmutes your line and lets you know it's your turn, please state your name, indicating the topic you're speaking on, and a 2-minute timer will begin. At the 2-minute mark, we'll announce time and your microphone will be muted. We now open our general comment period. Isaac, please start with our first comment.
We don't appear to have anybody here for a comment today.
Well, that was a short comment. Thank you, Isaac. And the first item is public hearings. We have none at this time. So we'll move on to item C1, which is the approval of minutes for meetings of Tuesday, February 9th, May 4th, and July 20th, 2021. I'll look for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the minutes.
Second.
I have a motion from Board Member Fowler, a second from Board Member Ferris. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That motion passes unanimously with Board Member Valdemore's absent. Item C2, Rda Audit Review and Approval for Fiscal Year 2020 to 2021. At the table, I have Mary Beth Thompson and Michael, well, I don't see. Oh, they're probably up there. There you are. Mary Beth Thompson and Michael Michelson from Eddie Bailey.
Good afternoon. All right, so is it my turn?
Yes, it is. Go right ahead, sir.
Okay. All right, then I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I apologize, that's the wrong. Well, thank you for having me today. I'll start talking while I meddle with that. My name's Mike Mickelson. I'm the audit partner with Eide Bailey that performed the audit of the redevelopment agency. We have previously provided to you our auditor's report, and hopefully you have that in your packet. If not, I've shared my screen and hopefully you can see that now. This is our auditor's report and the financial statements. The financial statements are the organizations and the culmination of a year's worth of financial transactions. What belongs to us is these 2 pages on pages 2 and 3 that consist of our auditor's report. In the middle of the page, it starts a section called Auditor's Responsibility. Just so you're aware, when we begin our audit, we begin by assessing risk related to the various financial statement line items and types of transactions that we'll audit. We gain and document an understanding of internal controls, and we establish a materiality threshold. And that materiality threshold is defined in our auditing standards as the threshold above which we believe a misstatement will change the financial statement user's judgment. And the misstatement below that threshold, the financial statement user won't change their judgment, and it can likely be passed on or not made. Once we establish those 3 things, we design our audit procedures. An area that has a larger materiality and a higher risk, when using a sampling application, will have a larger sample. An area with less materiality and lower risk will have a lower sample or maybe fewer procedures performed. And when we perform all those procedures and gather our audit evidence, we determine what kind of auditor's opinion we'll issue. And I've put in a red box there our auditor's opinion, so it's easier to see. But we have issued an unmodified opinion for the year ended June 30, 2021. And that's the clean opinion, the opinion that states that the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects in relation to generally accepted accounting procedures. Page 3, which I've just scrolled to, includes some other information that's not considered modifications, but it is additional information. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which sets accounting principles for government entities, requires some additional information. So immediately following our auditor's report is what's called management's discussion and analysis. And that has some analysis of what happened in the organization during the year. Then following the footnotes are some supplementary schedules related to pensions and some notes to that supplementary information. As you can see in that top paragraph where I've underlined in red, we do not express an opinion on that required supplementary information. We perform a few minor procedures where we read that and make sure that it's consistent with everything we gathered during our audit, but we do not express an opinion on that. We're not required to. But that information does accompany the financial statements in our auditor's report. So we're required to let the reader know what level of assurance we provide. And then at the very back are some supplementary information related by project area. We perform limited procedures on that. We do tie that out to the information that we've audited and to the financial statements themselves, so that in that last sentence that's underlined, we provide an in relation opinion that says that those schedules at the back are fairly stated in relation to the financial statements taken as a whole. So that's our auditor's report. It's an unmodified opinion. In looking at internal control during the course of our audit, we did not have any control deficiencies to report to you this year. And so with that, that's what I'll say about the financial statements or the auditor's opinion. We did not have any audit adjustments. So the financial statements that you looked at during the course of the year periodically do not differ from what's provided in the packet with our auditor's opinion. Maybe the format looks a little bit different because it's in a format that's consistent with GAAP and with the city's ACFR that they will be rolled up into. But there were no audit adjustments, so it doesn't look different from what you have already reviewed. The other thing we did, when there's a board such as yourselves that is charged with governance, we're required to issue another letter that's not part of our auditor's report, but it is addressed to the board. And I'm trying to share my, and I chose the wrong one again. I will pull that up quickly, but it just has some required communications, and some of those things we've already discussed, such as the auditor's responsibility I've already mentioned there. Okay, there it is. So in this letter, as I said, I've already talked about this whole first section, and that's our auditor's responsibility. So I'm going to scroll to the second page. Some things that were required to communicate to you are whether or not there was any changes in accounting principles. And so the top section refers to note 1, where the accounting principles selected by the organization are disclosed in the financial statements. There were no new accounting principles that were required to be adopted, so there are no changes in accounting principles. And the second thing I'd like to point out is in the middle, the significant accounting estimates section. Well, most of the information in the financial statements is some level of an estimate, and we're required to communicate to you what we feel is more significant. And that's based on the subjectiveness or the difficulty in determining the estimate. So the most significant estimate in the RDA's financial statements, in our opinion, is the net pension liability. That is provided to you by Utah Retirement Systems, in which the city participates. That is determined by Utah Retirement Systems and by their internal and their third-party actuaries. So that's an actuarially determined number, so there are a lot of assumptions that go into that. Note the footnote that discusses that, I think it's note 7, talks about a lot of the assumptions that go into determining that liability. So, and then finally at the bottom, I've underlined the sentence that says there were no corrected or uncorrected misstatements, which I've already disclosed to you. If I scroll to page 3, it says that there were no disagreements with management over how to apply any accounting principles. We did receive the representation letter from management that's required at the end of our audit to issue our financial statements. And we are not aware of any consultations that management may have made with other CPAs, kind of seeking another opinion in how to apply accounting principles. So with that, if you want to read the rest of that at your leisure, you can. It's fairly boilerplate, and we've presented this letter every year. So at this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about our audit process or our audit this year, or any of the letters or reports that we issued.
Thank you, Mr. Michelson.
You're welcome.
Mary Beth, did you have any comments before we open the floor to discussion? Okay, thank you. Board members, any questions about the audit? All right, no questions. Looks like there's no questions. Looks like it was a clean audit. Thank you very much for that. I will look for a motion to approve the audit of fiscal year 2020 to 2021.
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion from Board Member Fowler, a second from Board Member Mono. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? That motion passes unanimously with Board Member Baldemore's absent. Thank you very much. We move on to number 3. Item number 3 is informational. It's the release of the 9-line project area seed funds. At the table, I have a host of people. Ben Ludke from the Council Office Policy Analysis. From RDA, I have Danny Walls, Tracy Tran, Lauren Parisi, and I should have on the online Court and Tom. Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The board originally appropriated almost $2.2 million of seed funds for both the 9-line and the State Street project areas. The funds were intended to be flexible and available to both project areas, depending on what opportunities came forward in each area. The current available to spend balance is almost $493,000. The request in front of you today is to spend $96,000 for 2 projects. First is $70,000 for a crosswalk over 900 South at 745 West. This would connect the new West End redevelopment on the north side to a community garden on the south side, as well as the 9-line trail and an adjacent bike park. The second request is for $26,000 for environmental testing and remediation at a recently acquired RDA property at the southeast corner of 900 West and 400 South. The 2 requests with the total cost of $96,000, this is coming to you outside of a budget amendment. This is because the board previously appropriated the seed funds, and then the RDA staff returned to the board with proposed uses for the board's approval. So you would be approving these 2 proposed uses today if you support them. I also want to point out that the seed funds would be reduced to $397,000. So that would be the available amount if you have new opportunities in either the State Street or the 9-line project area that you want to pursue. So just remember there'd be $397,000 left. There is a possibility of some seed funds coming back to the board. If you recall the new track station at 650 South Main Street, the RDA board fronted $789,000, which is expected to be repaid by adjacent developments, but those funds have not come in, and it's not clear when they would. So we hope that they come in, but the available to spend balance, if you approve this today, would remain at that $397,000. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren and Tracy, who have a presentation for you.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
So remind me how much we originally appropriated as seed funds. You may have said that, but I probably
million.
wasn't listening at that moment.
2.2 million was the original total.
And this request would be 96.
Correct.
Or 96,000?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So I'll just quickly go over the proposed mid-block crosswalk, and I think Ben covered actually a lot of that, so I will just turn it over to Tom to see if he has anything to add to that project. It is a project that is being run by Transportation and Engineering.
Project.
You're muted, Tom.
We had hoped. Can you hear me okay? No?
No.
Give me just a second. How about now?
Good.
All right, thanks. So the original project we had hoped would include budget for mid-block crossings for most blocks along the 900 South reconstruction project extents, which are from 900 West to Lincoln Street, 945 East. Due to cost increases, construction cost increases, labor and materials, we've had to reduce most of those from our reconstruction of 900 South and extension of the 9-line trail, which will occur next year and the following year. However, this one mid-block crosswalk between 700 West and 800 West, as Ben outlined, was still very, very much desired by this developer of the West End development, which is that adaptive reuse project of those two buildings on the north side of 900 South at that same approximate address. So in discussing it with them, we've been discussing probably for about 8 or 9 months now, ways that we could still include this one mid-block crosswalk that would, I think, primarily connect their development to the destinations on the south side of the street, as well as provide some traffic calming. And in one of those funding opportunities or funding methods was through the RDA project area seed funds. So that's why we're here asking you today for the funding. If the funding is not approved, it wouldn't delay our project at all. It would simply remove that part of the project, that mid-block crossing, from the construction plans. It could be built again in the future. It would probably be a little bit more expensive as we wouldn't have our contractor out there already mobilized to do that work.
All right, so I can give just a brief overview of our second request. Again, I think Ben did a really great job of giving you the initial overview, but just some detail. The second request is for environmental remediation study on the site located at 877 West, 400 South. The RDA recently purchased this property back in July, if you'll remember, and this property is identified as a community node in our West Side Master Plan, which we hope to develop with some sort of community serving use in the future. But there was a former gas station on this site, and therefore the state is requiring us to do this initial study with a total cost of about $26,000 before any development can occur. And the previous owner did agree to pay for half of environmental remediation costs, so that's why we're asking for about $18,000 at this time for the study, which includes a little buffer in case there's a cost increase or there's future environmental work that has to be done. So that is that project.
Thank you very much, Tom, Lauren. Any questions from the board?
One quick question. What's the design of the crosswalk? We're not talking $96,000 for just 2 painted lines, right?
No.
Do you want me to handle that, Tracy?
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, the crosswalk includes rectangular rapid flashing beacons, which are the kind of the strobing yellow lights on both sides of the street, as well as in the median of the street. It would also construct a new median that would occupy the space that the center turn lane, two-way left turn lane, typically occupies. And then it would, and then it would be a brick patterned. It's not actually brick; it's colored concrete, but a brick patterned concrete crosswalk that spans the 2 lanes, one in each direction of 900 South in that future design.
So matching the
so all
designs
of
that are
that
very
material
nearby.
and would approximately equal that project amount.
So just matching the designs that are very nearby on 9th West already with the...
Yep, that's correct.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Any further questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just for my memory, can I get a quick recap on the 877 West 400 South property? When did we acquire that, and do we have an anticipated use? I know you said a community node, but has that started the RFP process or anything like that, or?
It hasn't started. We officially acquired the property this past July, and our first step really is to complete this environmental remediation work, but it is zoned residential mixed use, so we anticipate kind of ground floor commercial and housing above to activate that corner, but we'll get working on the details of that soon.
Thanks.
I will add that it is already an existing operating business as a commercial kitchen for food trucks and the like. So it is, and we are continuing that operation in the meantime.
I would just add two things. It's a key intersection for that community because it's one of the only east-west streets that has a bridge that goes over the train tracks. So that's one of the reasons it was a targeted node. The other thing is it was originally purchased with the seed funds. So this is another use of the seed funds for the same property.
Any other further questions? I have one question. On the study and the remediation of the area, does it go all the way out to the street? Does it go further than just the zoning boundary of the property? Because the property doesn't, just want to make sure that the remediation problems and the seeping doesn't go out and we're missing that part.
I would imagine it goes beyond the property, but they're having to follow the state standards, so I'll make sure that they do. I'm not certain what the boundaries are.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other further questions, they're asking for a straw poll to release the funds for the seed. So I look for a straw poll to release the funds.
Mr. Chair, I would propose a straw poll that we release these funds for these two requests.
Any questions on that? All in favor of the straw poll, give me a thumbs up. All right, that passes. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to item number 4, the resolution for Housing Development Loan Fund applications for the affordable housing. Allison is online, and I have Danny, Tracy, and Lauren also here from RDA. So Allison, kick it off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this briefing is about the proposed RDA NOFA allocations, and I'll explain what that means in just a couple minutes, and then allow Tracy and Lauren to fill you in on the details. Most of you will remember that the extensive process earlier this year, most of you will remember the extensive process earlier this year for the board to adopt the new Housing Development Loan Program, or HDLP framework. The HDLP offers low-cost loans as an incentive for developers to build affordable housing in Salt Lake City. The board's work this spring included approving the Housing Funds Allocation Policy, the Housing Development Loan Program, or HDLP policy, and the fiscal year 2022 affordable housing priorities. That sounds like a lot of the same words over and over again, but those are 3 distinct approvals that you did earlier this year. Today, the board will review and potentially approve RDA staff recommendations for allocating $5.3 million or more in affordable housing funds. These were offered through the most recent NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability. Just as a reminder, it's the board who makes the final determination of which applications to fund and at what amount. And then finally, there are policy questions in the staff report. I won't go through them now for the sake of time and just turn it over to Tracy and Lauren.
Thanks, Allison. So I'll just give a brief overview of kind of the process that we went through, and Tracy's going to give a overview of the recommended projects.
And can we get the PowerPoint up? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so to start, a total of $8 million was released for affordable housing projects on September 8th of this year. Again, there's $5.3 million available for projects citywide and $2.7 available for projects located in high opportunity areas. To market this opportunity, we posted the application on Utah's public procurement website, the RDA's website, social media, and sent out a mass email and press release. Staff also held an informational session for developers on September 24th, and the application period closed on October 29th. Altogether, we received 8 applications totaling $11.4 million in funding requests. None of the proposed projects are located in high opportunity areas, so those funds will remain available for other projects to apply for on a first come, first served basis. So if you could flip to the next slide. This year's housing funding priorities set by the board were included in the NOFA guidelines for applicants to review and also considered as a part of the review committee's recommendation. This year, family housing, target populations, neighborhood safety, home ownership, and transportation opportunities were among the board's top priorities, and that was relayed to the applicants. Next slide. The first 2 priorities, including funding, leveraging, and sustainability, were made threshold requirements this year that all projects have to meet. And so as a part of their application, projects were required to demonstrate how private funds will be utilized to maximize public resources, or RDA funds. Projects were also required to submit a design to earn Energy Star score of at least 80 or an equivalent energy use intensity. And all of the projects submitted detailed information regarding how this environmental standard would be met upon loan closing if it hasn't been met already. Next slide. So here is a map of the high opportunity areas, moderate areas in light blue and high in dark blue. Again, these areas indicate where residents have a greater chance of upward mobility. However, we didn't receive any projects in the high opportunity areas, but you can see highlighted in yellow where we did receive our 8 submittals this year. So now Tracy will go over the review process and the review committee's funding recommendations.
Thank you, Lauren. Next slide, please. So after conducting an initial threshold review and project evaluation, staff forwarded all the applications to a review committee that comprised of members of the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board, a few members of the Redevelopment Advisory Committee, and representatives from the RDA, CAN, and Housing Stability. So the review committee considered the following in their review. They looked at the funding priorities, the project readiness, the content and quality of the application, qualifications and experience of the applicant and the development team, the content, effectiveness, and appropriateness of the financial details, building and site design. And so the applications that were recommended for funding in this round did meet a lot of these criteria. The top 4 that were recommended for funding met the threshold requirements and the funding priorities. They have also secured financing and tax credits, and they are ready to be built soon, so they were ready to break ground within 6 to 9 months. And the costs, the review committee also looked at the cost per unit, cost per affordable unit for these projects. And one thing that's not noted on here is they also considered the AMI mix of the applications. Next slide. So here is a chart of all of the recommended applications or projects recommendations for funding through the Housing Development Loan Program. So they ranked the projects 1, 2, and then 2 projects are tied for 3rd. So you can see here we have the Silos, 144 South, 500 East, the Nest, and Schmidt Apartments. The first 2 projects were recommended for their full funding amount. Due to the $5.3 million funds that we had, the remaining amount they just split between the two projects that were tied for 3. So the Nest and the Schmidt apartments were not fully funded, so they were partially funded. But as you can see from this chart, these projects would produce almost 600 affordable units. All of these projects have received their tax credits, and they have secured financing. So they are really close to being ready to go. So they also have a mix of, you can see the AMI mixes and the bedroom mixes here in the next slide. And then this slide just shows all of the applications that we received, and it also shows what amounts were funded and what amounts were not funded. And so as you can see with these recommendations, the entire 5.3 million would be used, and none of the high opportunity, none of the 2.7 high opportunity funds would be used. So for the board's consideration today, just a few things. So through the annual housing development funding strategy, it was noted that that Rda staff would make available 3 NOFAs, so one focused on citywide, one focused on emergency gap financing, and then, or emergency gap funding, and then high opportunity NOFA. So we did tackle the citywide and the high opportunity this time. And we do hope to put out an emergency kind of gap NOFA sometime early next year. So any projects that are needing just some extra assistance, we'll be able to tap into those funds. So we had asked the Housing Development Loan Program Review Committee that if there were additional funds that became available, what would their priority be in funding these projects? And they agreed that the 2 projects that only received partial funding should be fully funded. That was their recommendation. So for the RDA board's consideration tonight, we are looking at whether or not you want to approve the review committee's recommendation for the $5.3 million in funding, and whether or not you'd like to allocate some emergency funds towards this round of applications. One thing I wanted to know, I think in the staff report there was just something I wanted to clarify. The staff report mentioned that there was $1.8 million of fund balance that was rolled into this no fund. That's not accurate. So what had happened is we had a previous loan that was committed, but that loan expired. That commitment expired. Sorry. So those amounts were just rolled back into those funds. So there would be an extra 1.5 million available on top of the 1 million we have in the emergency fund. So there would be up to 2.5 million available for emergency funds, but it would be up to the board whether or not you would like to allocate some of that 2.5 million towards some of these applications, or if you'd like to just continue keeping about 2.5 million for the emergency notice of funding availability that we'd have next year. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but so I just want to note here, so if you wanted to fund the remaining amounts for the 2 projects tied for third, it would be $1,225,000, and that would leave a balance of about $1,275,000 for the emergency NOFA. I'm sure you have questions, so.
I'll start with Board Member Mono.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, Tracy.
Yes.
The 2.5 million is what's remaining that could be allocated as a NOFA for emergency gap financing, and that would mean that a project is running into financing trouble or construction costs got too high and they need some additional money kind of on a short-term, quick basis. That makes sense as a priority. Now, does the Nest and the Schmidt apartments, have they indicated that without their full financing, they are in an emergency? Have both of them said that? Or what indication do we have that those are in need of emergency financing?
Yes, so both of those projects have already received tax credits, and they have senior commitments from senior lenders, and so they're pretty ready to go. And with just a partial commitment, they would still need to fill that gap somehow. So they would either need to go look for other sources of funding, whether through the county or the state, or they'd have to kind of play around with their budget, maybe increase the developer fee or kind of cut costs by taking some amenities out or something like that. So they do need the funds, and they would need to fill that gap.
And what is the typical process for us to approve requests of that emergency funding stream? Is there, what does that typically look like? Because my question is, are we bypassing a sort of set of predetermined standards that we're already looking at? Like, does the project actually need a pool to be successful or not? Like, is that, I mean, what are the standards that they would have to go through if we said, no, you have to wait for this future NOFA, as opposed to just approving it now? Are we bypassing something that we could actually get more information about?
Yeah.
How necessary that is?
So I believe it would go through kind of a similar process as we are kind of going through now, but instead of being a competitive process where you're reviewing, 8 projects against each other, you would just be reviewing the one against kind of the priorities that you've set today or through the earlier this year, and then kind of the housing development loan program that was approved by the board earlier this year. So there are some standards and requirements within there, so it would kind of go through a similar process.
And just to clarify, just from a staff perspective, I think is this the first time we've used kind of that strategy of emergency funding versus standard funding? And is that, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, I could see from the construction market volatility that maybe from a strategy perspective it makes sense, but this is the first time I'm aware of that we've done it that kind of bifurcated way.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I think if you look at last year was a good example where we didn't expend all of the NOFA funds, so we did have some funds remaining, and then as a result of that, we did receive an application from Colony B, and that's how we funded that as kind of an emergency gap financing loan. So looking forward to this year, and when we came to the board and approved, you allocated that 5.3 to go in the NOFA and then $1 million set aside. The understanding with that is to have that set aside though, so that after the NOFA was done, if either a project did come in that we wanted to consider, we would have funding available, or as Tracy indicated, we could always just leave that funding out there on an open-ended basis, or you could even do another NOFA in 6 months and say this money is now available for these purposes. So the policy itself lays out those different options, and I think as we propose it as part of this year's budget, it was just to have that $1 million or an amount set aside available for loans like Colony B that could be coming in. Costs have gone up, funding has gone down. We could respond to those. So that was the original intent, is just to have a set aside of funds available throughout the year and not spend it all through this NOFA process. Clear as mud, right?
And more questions about this whole process. So would we just say we'll do a NOFA for the emergency gap side of the house in 6 months, and that would give other applicants time, and also these 2 applicants the time to maybe look at other finances and other emergencies that they could possibly have, and then they basically go through the same iteration just on that $2.whatever million that we have for the emergency gap, and that would just be the emergency gap NOFA, not other NOFA. Is that how?
Yeah, I think you could do it either that way. You could do another NOFA for a period of time, again in the year, or I think what we would probably recommend as staff is just to leave those funds there on an open-ended basis. First come, first serve for projects that come in. If one of those happened to be one of these 3 applicants, I think at that time we would just be looking to have them further along with their capital stack and or more prepared, ready to go. And if Tracy has anything to further clarify that, I'd defer to her.
No, I was just going to bring up kind of the emergency kind of first come, first serve aspect of it that I didn't know before. So it would be different than this round in that if you send in a complete application first, we'll review that one first. So that would go through the process first, and it wouldn't be a process where we'd see all of the applications at once.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I guess it strikes me that those 2 different methods of funding projects make sense because projects have different timelines and different things happen during the process of a development. But it seems like there should be some different standards. Like why would I, as a developer, wait for the annual NOFA to come out and apply when I'm going to be competitive against 7 other projects, as opposed to just applying for the emergency? It seems like there should be some different threshold of like what qualifies as an emergency, thereby allowing me to apply for funding outside of the typical NOFA schedule. And so maybe that's the question I was trying to ask earlier, but is there a different standard? Is there a different qualifier that says this is an emergency and therefore we can use this emergency process versus the typical process? And if so, does the Nest and the Schmidt apartments meet that threshold standard of being considered an emergency?
I think the easy way to clarify that is taking it within the context of, as I said, with the Colony B loan, where you had a project that was ready to go, that they were getting ready to break ground, they were getting their final construction costs, and then as a result of that, they had an emergency gap come up versus encouraging developers to wait for that round. I think the other function of that is the amount of money that we make available. Obviously, with the NOFA, you're looking at over $5 million versus whatever you as a board decide to keep and hold on to as emergency gap financing. And so if we as staff, if you would like us to further clarify that, or if you would like to give that direction as part of what you allocate today versus what you roll over, we can certainly take that and apply that to any requests we get throughout the rest of the year.
And along that, and there's no limit to the emergency gap, and we could give you could recommend us to give the full 2.3 to one developer for their one project if we thought that desired it.
Yes, if you wanted to allocate the entire $2.5 million right now available for emergency, you could do that. Certainly would not be what we'd recommend, but you have that authority as part of this approval, yes.
Right, thanks. Any further questions about this, the funding?
I do. Please, Mr. Chair. So I am looking at like the score sheet, if you will, if you can call it the score sheet. And I mean, it appears that while there are priority points, that some of the projects that had more priority points were not recommended for funding because we took into account other things, I'm assuming. And so what are those other things that the committee took into account besides those priority points?
Yeah, so a big part of that was like project readiness, their financial stack. Some of those projects didn't have commitments for tax credits or senior lenders and whatnot. So those were actually really, like the committee was actually really focused on that because I think the thought behind that was, well, we could fund it, but that would just drag out. They wouldn't be built for, a couple years or whatnot. So they were thinking of funding projects that were ready to go and, we could get the money out and then hopefully get that money back at some point, Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any further questions?
It doesn't have to do so much with the funding. I'm really stressed out by how little family housing, like there's 4 3-bedroom units that are going to go for below $1,200 a month from what I saw in here. And I mean, our school district is counting on us to solve this, and I don't know what the key is, but I just want it to be on record that that's a really big source of stress with this.
Mr. Chair, I had one other comment, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
We keep seeming to run into this problem with our NOFAs in the high opportunity areas. Can someone tell me why? What do we need to do to get people to build in our high opportunity areas? And to we're offering money here. Go build in, take our money and build in these areas.
I actually did a lot of analysis when I first started at the RDA on the high opportunity areas, and there are a few kind of very regulatory restrictions. A lot of the high opportunity areas are located within single family zones and areas that are already built out. And so there is very little very few areas that have multifamily zones where an affordable project could be built. And another part of it is it's also within a lot of it is within historic district, which those are already really established in trying to convert, build something new is challenging. Go ahead.
Mr.
Sorry,
Oh,
if I
sorry.
could just add to that real fast, I'd like to remind the board, not getting into the details of the property itself, but if you remember, we were trying to pursue an opportunity of buying a property. And so we were actively working to try to spend those funds. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like that opportunity is going to come through. So I think we're at the point now that we can go back out and see what we can do. So we're trying.
Thanks. No, I agree with Board Member Fowler on this sort of frustration with why we can't get anything built in high opportunity areas. My question is, when was the high opportunity area set, and do we review that annually? Because some of those areas, I think, are fairly high opportunities that are technically outside of that boundary. So is that something that we just, how was that set, and when, and does it get updated?
I don't have it directly in front of me, but I know it was done around 2017. I think it was Hand at the time worked with Kempsey Gardner, and Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute helped develop that criteria. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it was an index developed with in partnership with the Kempsey Gardner Institute, and I think the intention was to update it with the census numbers this year. I think that it's not updated. I know that it's not updated annually, which is a challenge of the data set, but it's sort of the best indicator we have than to otherwise just draw arbitrary lines in the city where we think development's expensive over here. So
do we need to, will we need to allocate funds in this next budget or in an amendment in order to reanalyze where that should be based on the updated census data? Is that already in the works, or does that need to come from us?
I think that would be something we'd want to work with the Housing Stability Division on, one, how to update it, what the extent of that would be, and then also, do you look at expanding or changing some of the criteria that make up how a high opportunity area is defined? So I think it's a good opportunity to probably do all of those things.
I mean, I think based on what Tracy just told us, that we need to look at that, because we're saying, here's where we want you to develop affordable housing. But also in our city council hats, we're saying you're not allowed to build affordable housing there because it's all single family zones. So we do need to, I think, relook at where that boundary is set and try and use those funds accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would ask that if we're working with housing instability, that we do also work or see if we can work with the Kem Gardner Institute as well. And I think I would be supportive of allocating some dollars towards that to update it if we needed to work with them. I know that
we have
we kind of have a contract with them.
Yeah, we have an existing contract with them, and I, in the bowels of my memory, we did discuss once the census was complete that would be a good opportunity to update them. I know that Dr. Perlick raised some concerns when the census was not collecting the level of data that they were hoping for, that it may impact indices like this because some of it relies on some of that deeper dive data. But we haven't engaged with them recently about that specifically, but you're scheduled to have a briefing from them in the first meeting in January, and I think that would be a great opportunity to renew the conversation. So,
will somebody flag that for us so that I don't forget to ask them about that? And then the other thing I was just thinking of, it would be interesting maybe after we update this, or now, depending on how long that indice might take to update, is to look at the zoning and overlay of what the where the high opportunity zones are, and if there is a way to do some rezones. I know that Nick Norris is probably cringing right now and wanting to punch me, but because we still haven't dealt with RMF 30, but but there might be, I mean, maybe there is some opportunity to look at those zones and change them so that we can build in those areas, right? And kind of look at that overlay. 'Cause I hadn't even thought about that, but you bring up really good points, Tracy, so thanks.
Thank you very much. And just on the map side of the house, the high opportunity zone is a nice square box, and I know it just doesn't stop on whatever street that is. So could you either send it out to us so we actually know where it is across the whole city?
Yep.
That'd be great to have. Any other further questions, comments? So we're looking for a motion to approve the funding of $5.3 million to the 4 projects, fully funded the top 2 on the Silos and the 500 East project, and partial funding the Nest and the Schmidt project. So that's one motion. And is there a second motion about the emergency gap? Would that be a separate motion?
I think it would be up to the board whether or not you'd like to allocate any of those emergency funds towards these current projects.
So let's just look for the first motion of the funding of the 5.3 billion.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the funding recommendations of $5.3 million to those top 4 projects, as noted in the staff report, or the whatever, transmittal. Thanks.
I have a motion from Board Member Mono, a second from Board Member Ferris. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That motion passes unanimously with Board Member Valdemoros absent. Does anyone want to make a motion on the emergency gap?
You don't need to take action.
We don't need to take.
Necessarily, no.
Right.
If it's there, then it's up to the staff to bring it back to you guys. Sorry, I should say that in the microphone. You don't need to take action on that piece necessarily. I think once the staff receives applications, they'll bring it back to the board for action. Is that right?
Yes, the only thing I would add to that is if you did want to take a portion of it to fully fund those 2
Something today.
loans versus leaving the rest of it, and then you're right, we would bring back information on those.
And I know that you answered this when Darren asked it, but the 2 projects that are not fully funded would feel that they are in an emergent situation with funding. I mean, let's be fair, most developers come to us in an emergent situation, but in reality, the project wouldn't go forward, or, I mean, that's where we're at.
Yeah, they would have to find some other sources of funding to fill that gap. So whether they come back to us or whether they try to find some other sources out in the community.
Is there a deadline on how long they have to do that?
It's really dependent on their project. I believe both of those projects wanted to break ground by summer of this year. Do you remember Schmidt? Yeah. So they have some time, but
Their costs, it could be problematic because their budget could increase as costs increase, and they're looking for this funding, so.
I think the more commitments they have, the kind of their other commitments can kind of fall in line too, and then they can break ground sooner and get bids and whatnot, so. Kind of a
Mr. Chair,
chicken and egg.
my preference would be that we keep that in that emergency loan pot of money, because it seems like they could, if they need that funding, they could come back next week with a emergency application, right? Because there's no deadline and there's no calendar for that. So I say we see which of the 2 projects, if not both, come back with that, and then analyze it at that point. Because that seems like the process that we've already outlined. Again, I think we should probably clarify what that process is and what qualifies as an emergency. But it seems like there's no reason why they couldn't submit that second application, and then we can analyze it at that point before summer.
Yeah, and just a quick clarification, we'd have to release the notice of funding availability before they could respond. So they technically couldn't respond next week with an application because we'd have to release it.
And how long would that process be?
I don't know, Danny, what would you say?
I was taking notes and going to recommend that maybe what we do is we come back with both. Maybe we come back with more details on those projects, and if it truly is an emergency, and we can then forward at that time their request for funding. And then at the same time, we can come back to you as a board with maybe some parameters of then how the rest of those funds would be made available and what those conditions would be. Sounds like that would hit both of your concerns.
Yeah, as a child of a teenager, I'm always a fan of giving them a chance to self-resolve.
So what I'm gathering from the board is that we're not going to make a motion on it. Danny, you're going to go that direction, and we're all in agreement with that. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. We'll move on to item number 5, the resolution of the RDA Sustainable Development Policy. We have Allison online. We have Danny and Lauren. You're up at the table.
And Mr. Chair, this is actually, there was no staff report on this item, and so I say we leave the RDA staff on their own to do it all. Thanks.
You're on your own.
Okay, I think we can do it. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We're bringing this policy back to the board.
Sorry, Kara, could we bring up the presentation?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay. So we're returning to the board today with this policy for potential adoption. We've made a few changes since we presented to you back in October and heard your feedback. After we incorporated your feedback, we returned to our Redevelopment Advisory Committee in November and presented the updated policy to them, and they voted unanimously to forward a positive recommendation to the board. And if we could move to the next slide. We wanted to provide a little bit of background, especially for our new board members, so I'm going to wait 2 seconds, just on how we got where we are today with the Sustainable Development Policy. The idea for the RDA's policy came originally back from when Mayor Mendenhall was on the RDA Board of Directors and asked us to look at requirements for the environmental benefits that projects would bring if they were earning the sustainability incentive that the RDA offered, which at that time and still today, until this policy is adopted, is at 0.5% interest rate reduction for loans. And she asked us to look at requirements that would be more clearly defined and consistent that we could apply to the projects that qualify for that. So we started working with Utah Clean Energy, who's here today, and also the Salt Lake City Sustainability Department to begin drafting a policy. And we really wanted that policy to be within the framework of the city's sustainability goals of having 100% of the community's electricity supply come from renewable energy by 2030, and for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the community by 2040. So that's the framework that we were working in, and then our focus was refined even more with the target that was provided in Mayor Mendenhall's 2021 plan, which was for all new buildings that were funded with city money or RDA money to be emission-free by 2023. So if we can move to the next slide. I mentioned that currently the RDA offers a 0.5% interest rate reduction for loans for projects that meet our sustainability requirements. And the intent of this policy was to require baseline sustainability building design in almost all of the RDA funded projects. And that is what's identified here in the threshold requirements. And then we also wanted to identify program-specific requirements that are applicable to certain RDA programs and offer a higher level of incentive. So Lauren now is going to get into the details of what the policy covers.
Yeah, so since October, we made really a few minor changes to the policy, kind of in response to your comments and also our advisory board's comments. So the first is that the board had previously asked about lowering the dollar amount that would trigger compliance with this policy, specifically for rehabilitation projects. And to clarify, all new construction projects will have to comply with this policy no matter the dollar amount of funding, but we didn't want to overburden kind of smaller rehab projects that tend to ask for RDA funding to cover costly building code upgrades, especially as these rehab projects have some inherent level of sustainability. So that's the idea with that threshold there. That said, we did feel that we could lower this dollar amount from $400,000 to $200,000 to capture a few more projects to come into compliance with our policy, and also better align with our Granary District Adaptive Reuse Program, where projects can receive up to $200,000, so they'll be exempt, those adaptive reuse projects.
And Lauren, before you move ahead, maybe we could.
Oh, and that was, yeah, that was on another slide. If we could move, that was what I just spoke about. And then on this next slide, the next change, we had talked at the last board meeting about whether or not the interest rate incentives would really get people to implement our off-site net zero and on-site net zero requirements. And so we kept the 1% and 2% interest rate reductions the same. However, we added this language to the policy in red that gives staff kind of the discretion to assess whether or not a project should earn a larger interest rate reduction up to 1% more, and that's based on whether they're in kind of financial need or their senior lender has requirements that they need to comply with, and therefore may need a little bit more incentive than the 1% or 2%. So we added that language. That's the same language that's in our housing development loan program, so there's some consistency there. And we also had talked about last time kind of looking at numbers, real numbers for these interest rate reductions. So we came up with these hypothetical projects. And if we could switch to the next slide. Can we switch to the next slide?
Taylor, can you switch to the next slide? Or Delaney, can you switch to the next slide?
These are...
Maybe just keep going. I'm hearing we're having some Webex issues, so I'm just...
We have the packet.
These examples are in your staff report in case you have that in front of you. But just real quickly, for example, on a hotel type project that asks for a larger loan of about $7 million with a 12-year term, looking at a 1% reduction, they'll have a savings around $630,000. A 2% interest rate reduction, they'll have a savings of about $875,000. Then looking at a smaller loan request for a community garden type project, a request of $250,000 with a 30-year loan term, the 1% reduction would give them a $50,000 savings. The 2% reduction would give them about a $70,000 savings. So we just wanted to show those to you as we talked about that last time. And we as staff do feel that both scenarios offer significant savings relative to the dollar amount being requested, and we do feel like these interest rates should incentivize people to implement those net zero tactics. Next.
Apologies, we're still having some Webex issues, so we don't have the ability to advance or close slides, but we're working on it, so we can still keep going.
Okay.
And Lauren?
Yes.
Could I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Those assume that both loans are held to maturity?
Are held.
Year and for the entire duration of the 12 and 30-year term?
Yes.
Okay,
the second one's a cash flow loan, so it'll be until it's paid off, but yeah.
I see. Thanks.
We also, I believe, Councilmember Dugan, you had kind of a question about how on-site solar could be accommodated off a roof or on like a freestanding structure, a garage or something like that, and that can definitely be accommodated. We have a footnote in the policy that you can put on-site solar on garages, freestanding structures, and carports, so that wouldn't be a problem. Then we do have language in the policy that if approved, the policy will become effective immediately. However, we did add this specific language that states it will apply to all projects that submit an application after the policy's adoption. So it will not apply to projects retroactively that haven't submitted a formal application to us. The policy also states that threshold requirements must be met by all projects that anticipate receiving a building permit on or after January 1 of 2023, to exclude next year's emergency loan requests that will most likely be really far along in the design process and will be breaking ground in 2022. So they'll be excluded if they're breaking ground in 2022, which we don't anticipate many of those projects coming in next year, but there may be a few. And then finally, in terms of compliance, this is
Lauren,
actually,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, we're
Just
gonna
from a
pause.
recorder standpoint, because I guess we're having problems with Webex. The people in Webex can't hear our audio.
Okay.
Obviously a problem. So
Oh, no.
we're just going to pause for a minute, give the very smart technical people
of
to
course.
figure out what's going on.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Is it back? Okay, it's back.
Good to go?
The
All
internet
right.
elves are busy today.
You guys are good. Okay, well, I'm almost done, but the last thing that we changed is we removed the 30-month compliance period. This is incorrect on the slide, but instead we'll kind of determine when projects have to come into compliance per their contract with the RDA. So we'll really have to kind of set up a system to monitor these projects and make sure that they're implementing the sustainability standards that they plan on. Additionally, we wanted to note that there are a lot of other incentives in Utah, whether they be kind of tax breaks or just funding in general to implement sustainable building design. And I anticipate that we'll have trainings for developers to become accustomed to these new requirements. And with those trainings, we'll also let them know that there are these incentives outside of the city that can help them implement and meet the standards within this policy. So wanted to bring that up quickly. Finally, since October, we also sent the policy out to other city departments for review and met with Rocky Mountain Power, as there's some interlap between all of us. And really, we received a pretty positive feedback and no kind of red flags. So we felt we could move it forward to you all today to vote on its adoption. So with that, those are all the changes, but please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Any questions from the board?
I just have a procedural question. Where does this get codified in our city code or RDA code? Or how does this work?
RDA policy.
RDA
So you
policy.
adopt it, and then it's part of your RDA guiding policies that then help the staff understand what your expectations are for the programs.
Okay, thanks.
And I just want to just go back to the non-compliant projects. We need to make sure we have a very clear understanding and incentive for them to comply, because I'm always worried about, oh yeah, I got all this energy sustainability, but there's absolutely zero to it. So we really need to make sure that that incentive for them to comply is clear, and we need to do it sooner than later.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
That's a really great comment. I think something Kara and I kind of talked a lot about to ensure these projects are meeting the sustainability requirements. And thankfully, we're teaming up with our sustainability department so that projects will have to submit to that energy benchmarking program every year. And then we'll have to follow up on kind of the higher net zero incentives and make sure they do that. So we'll look at that as well.
Right. And would we have a third party do the inspection, or would we do that internally?
I think we would kind of rely on our building services team to do those inspections, and we can kind of coordinate to make sure they're meeting or implementing what they submitted to the RDA.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board? So I'm looking for a motion to adopt this resolution that would approve the sustainable development policy.
So moved.
I have a motion from Board Member Fowler, a second from Board Member Ferris. All in favor say yes or aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? That motion passes with Board Member Fowler Baltimore absent. All right, we're moving on to item number 6, potential revision to the guiding framework. Danny, you're up on stage. And we have Danny Walls, the RDA Chief Operating Officer, on the stage.
Okay, I actually think Court's going to kick this one off.
And
for
sorry,
us.
and Court's here also
Yeah.
online. Thank you, Court.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. What we have for you today is a resolution to consider, and the resolution would make some revisions to the RDA's guiding framework. That's a really important document for us. It includes our mission statement. It includes 3 core values that articulate the economic, the social, as well as the physical outcomes that are expected on the projects that we work on. The guiding framework also includes a project evaluation process, and that process helps us to identify the public benefits that are created by projects that we participate in and be able to quantify them and to measure them. And so we had a presentation with the board in October where we went over these potential revisions, and the catalyst for the revisions is conversations we've been having with the board around the topics of equity and inclusion, as well as sustainable development. So that's kind of the background and the need for the revisions. And so we had a good conversation in October. A couple of comments were made, which I'll summarize here in a second, but then we also took those into account and took the document back to our advisory committee, the Redevelopment Advisory Committee, and they recommend unanimously the approval of the document that's in front of you today. So the comments that were made back in October were, could we, and maybe I could just share a screen here with you really quickly. Will you let me know when you see that?
Yes, we got it.
And you all see that? Thank you. Zoom in here a little bit. This is the guiding framework document as proposed. And one of the comments that came out of the discussion with the board in October was, could we change the wording of economic growth in the mission statement to economic opportunity? And you can see we've made that revision. One of the other suggestions that was made was that we consider whether or not we could actually take the titles of the values of equity and inclusion and neighborhood vibrancy and move that language, directly right into the mission statement. And we gave that, I would say, a good try, the good college try there, and never really landed on a version of the mission statement that we felt was as clear or as concise as what you're seeing here. And so that, I think the concepts of those values are certainly represented in the mission statement, but the exact wording is not. So wanted to make sure you understood that. And then the third comment that came out of the conversation with the board in October was some potential revisions to the intent language around one of these livability benchmarks, and it has to do with affordable commercial space. And so we have made that. You can see that in attachment D to your memo. That actually is kind of like a red line format of all of the benchmarks as well as their intent language. So the intent language isn't something that we include in this particular document, so it's not something you would be considering adopting today, but I wanted to point out that we have made that revision. So that's kind of where things stand. The mission statement right now, you can see, and because words matter, can I read this? Is that appropriate?
Sure.
The Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City strengthens neighborhoods and business districts to improve livability, create economic opportunity, and foster authentic, equitable communities, serving as a catalyst for strategic development projects that enhance the city's housing opportunities, commercial vitality, public spaces, and environmental sustainability. And then the values you can see are economic opportunity, which is we invest in the long-term prosperity and growth of our local economy. Equity and inclusion, we prioritize people-focused projects and programs that encourage everyone to participate in and benefit from development decisions that shape their communities. And then lastly, neighborhood vibrancy. We cultivate distinct and livable places that are contextually sensitive, durable, connected, and sustainable. And then outside of that, there were a couple of changes to the titles of some of these livability benchmarks, and some instances where those have been merged into one. None of that has changed since our conversation with you in October. So I'm happy to go into more detail if that's appropriate, but that's kind of the overview.
Thank you very much, Court. Danny?
Sure. Nothing to add.
Board, do I have any questions for RDA and Court?
I just missed something that Court was just saying. There was a second thing that we talked about that we tried to incorporate but weren't able to. Can you say again what that was? Because I didn't.
Yeah, Darren. Sorry, Mr. Board Member Mono. Let me get that straightened out. I believe you had made a comment in the October meeting that we take the titles of the values, so that would be equity and inclusion and neighborhood vibrancy, and actually use those exact words in the mission statement. And so we tried to do that and kind of created a lot of different versions of the mission statement that incorporated that suggestion. But we didn't really land on something that we felt like was as clear and concise as what you're saying before you now. So we did not make that change. We considered it. We did a bunch of revisions, but it has not been changed.
Okay, well, thanks for trying.
I want to say thank you for prioritizing this. I know it seems like silly semantics, but this is an actual invitation that protects the dignity of our citizens as we grow together. And you're right, words matter, because how we process identifying our constituents by systemic gaps is not an awesome way to identify them. This identifies us by potential and by collaboration. So thank you. It's a lot of hard work to evaluate each syllable. So thank you for doing that.
Well, and thank you for that comment. I would like to pass that on to staff. They worked very hard, and there was a lot of wordsmithing. There were a lot of meetings, and they worked very hard to get it right. And a lot of that came because of exactly what you said and how much they believe in getting it right. So appreciate that comment.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to thank the staff as well. I know how hard they've worked on this document for a number of years now, and it always, I think, began as sort of a living, breathing document, and we see that now as we continue to evolve and really monitor and evaluate the RDA and the agency itself. And with that, so thank you, all of you. I don't know if you're looking for a motion to adopt, but I'd like to make a motion to adopt this, whatever we're called, what is it, the guiding framework.
Aye.
Okay, we're moving on to item number 7, report announcements from the executive director. And I don't see, is the mayor?
I know, but I can't tell.
Can't tell. Court, could you unshare your screen? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't hear for a second there. Sorry about that.
I don't think the mayor is here.
Okay.
And number 8, report and announcements from the Rda staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few super quick announcements. Number 1, updates on projects. Both our West End project and Jackson Apartments project have been completed. West End is still in the leasing phase, and they anticipate holding a ribbon cutting sometime next year. Jackson Apartments have scheduled their reopening for Thursday, January 13th at 10 a.m. And both Mayor Mendenhall and Board Chair Valdemoris will be speaking in that event. It's been a while since we've been with you too, and so we've had some staffing changes. We've had 2 new hires to the RDA, one of which is sitting behind me. Her name is Catherine Hackman, and she comes to us to fill the role of a communications and outreach assistant as we expand our communications and community engagement efforts. She's been with the agency for 6 weeks. And then we also welcome Eric Holmes, who is serving the role as our data manager. This is his 2nd day, so he showed up to work today, which means we didn't scare him too much yesterday. So we certainly appreciate that and look forward to having him come on board and start coordinating and enhancing our ability to utilize data and help make data-based decisions within the agency. So we're certainly excited to have that on board. And then a couple of announcements for Gallivan. I think we updated you that Bart Walker retired after 20 years. We've filled that position with a gentleman named John Boyack, who has been hired and has hit the ground running. He has jumped into opening of the ice rink, which we are pleased to report that just in the first few weeks, they have already surpassed all of their numbers from 2019 at this point in time. So ice rink is open and doing great. And then Talitha always wants me to speak to excellence in the community. Over the pandemic, they have now streamed over 170 concerts, gathering 13.8 million views in the process. So they are going strong and doing a great job. So that is all the updates for staff. Unless you have any questions, on behalf of all of RDA staff, we wish you happy holidays.
Thank you, Danny.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I have so many questions today. Can we get an update either in this meeting or in the next meeting about the State Street project area adoption and where we're at with the county and all that?
Quick update is we are having meetings with county staff and trying to finalize the information to submit to get that application processed and in front of their county council. And hopefully by the next time we meet, we might have a little bit more concrete information on where that exactly stands. So we will definitely do that.
Any further questions? All right, I moved to item D, written briefings. We have a written briefing for on the redevelopment semi-annual property report. Check your online briefing side. And we have nothing on the consent side, but we do have a closed session. So we need a motion for the closed session to discuss the purchase, exchange, and lease of real property and for attorney-client matters.
So moved.
A motion from Board Member Fowler, second by Board Member Ferris. All in favor say aye.
Aye. Actually, you have to roll call this,
Oh, we
right?
gotta
Because it's a closed session.
Okay, roll call. Board Member Warden.
Yes.
Board Member Fowler.
Yes.
Board Member Mono.
Yes.
Board Member Ferris.
Yes.
Board Member Victoria.
Yes. That's what I get for hyphenating.
I apologize. Petro Estro. So that's a yes. I'm a yes. That motion passes with Board Member Valdemoris absent. So we are now going into closed session at this time.
And for those joining on Webex, there's a separate link. Please